welcome back to the weird world of knowing. And I'm delighted to have this guest on because so many people are interested in criminology. So many young people are going into, and people that I know as well, who are going into psychology and criminology and wanting to know about why people do these things and going into real depth about, well, whatever it is you've got to go into depth with. I think David's going to tell us a little bit more about this. I see how much I'm struggling with this already. I can't even say the words.
We'll get through it together, Rachel. Don't you worry.
But this, honestly, this is a real thing, and I do have to say, I am not just ignorant about this subject. I feel this so intensely in my body that the communication that goes up to my brain has huge resistance to even talking about it in any detail from me. I can hear other people say the words and I can ask the questions eventually, but actually the resistance of being in that energy is so huge for me. It is a struggle, and that is my reality. So first of all, I'm interested to know if anybody else has that response from things such as criminology and prison life and the depths of despair that people go to harm others, to harm each other. That's what I struggle with. And it is an actual physical thing, which I'll come back to and explain that in a little bit more detail. But first of all, welcome to David Scott, because David Scott, I think you're pretty much number one, really, aren't you, David, in having all this information about the background of and the ignorance that we have behind criminology and why people do these things.
Yes, that's right, Rachel. So one of the things that my research area has been on, as we'll come to as we go through, has been about those difficulties that people have in thinking about, understanding and responding to these very difficult issues that become part of the rubric of criminology. And I think that your immediate kind of reaction of, well, this is maybe something where my body's kind of saying, do I really want to kind of know about this? Because we almost kind of will anticipate this is going to be unwelcome knowledge when we start delving into these kind of issues. And I'm coming more from the actual response than the causes of the kind of issues. And I think that's where this notion of knowledge and ignorance becomes really important, because it's about how we respond to when we hear about harms, how we respond when we hear to wrongdoing, how we actually try to conceptualize and conceive what wrongdoing and harmful behaviors are in the first instance, and then how we actually as a society and also as individuals and communities look to take forward the best ways to actually try and develop some form of healing, some form of appropriate response that can actually deal with this very, very difficult subject matter. So I almost like your reaction at the start here, Rachel. I think it's probably one which many will share in various different ways. And it's one which I think is actually generated by the difficulties of the topic areas within criminology, whether that be prisons or whether that be the harms in the first instance.
And I just need to say, actually, I'm actually feeling physically quite nauseous already, just sort of thinking about being in this energy. In fact, there is no thinking about it. As soon as I set the intention for us to go there, I'm sort of in that energy and I feel it. And it is unpleasant because not because I have any judgment of why people do these things, but because of actually, it is as if I am the person who has received the either psychological damage, emotional damage, mental damage, or physical damage. And it's as if that's how I pick up on the energy. It's as if I am that energy of that person who is receiving the harm mentally, physically, emotionally. And it gives me a physical response to that. So
I think that's a really good place to start, Rachel, which is what kind of harms are we talking about here, and what kind of do we conceive as harm? And of course, we're thinking about harm in terms of hurt and injury and damage, and we're thinking about it in somebody who's potentially had some kind of impact on their life, which is going to be very, very negative. So harm, when we talk about harm and wrongdoing, we're talking about kind of negatives that have actually impacted on a person's kind of life. But what becomes really interesting from a criminological point of view is not so much kind of the intricacies of the harm. Of course, that's very, very important. But how we actually see and perceive the different kind of harms that occur within a given society. And we're actually very good at conceptualizing intentional harms and harms that direct individuals from another individual. So often when we kind of start thinking about these kind of issues, we start thinking about it on an individual level, and also a notion of intention, a very clear intention for one person to deliberately harm another. And of course, that's a very, very large part of what criminology is. And it's a very large part of where criminological knowledge has been generated, particularly through psychological and psychosocial studies, as you've kind of indicated at the top of the discussion. But there's actually a little bit more complexity to our thinking and our knowledge about harm. And that's when we start to think about it, not just on the notion of an individual level, but also in terms of a collective level, and also in terms of the key element in terms of power holders and those who have very little power. And then the other element which becomes very important is the issue of intention and deliberate intention, and that there's a deliberate target, because harms can also be generated by what we call moral indifference. They can also be generated where there is no direct intended harmful outcome perceived by the person or the people who are actually generating that harm. So harm doesn't just become about the actual intention, it becomes the focus on the harmful outcomes. And of course, those harmful outcomes can actually lead to serious injury and also death.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by that, David?
Well, for example, let's just think about perhaps the more serious thing here, which would be murder. So we can think about murder as intentional homicide. We can think about that as an individual who deliberately intends to take the life of another. And we know that that happens somewhere in the region of about 700 to 800 times every year in the UK. It's obviously not a stable kind of data, because it changes kind of with a specific circumstances. So we know that does happen. We know that people also are injured with maybe the intent to, or the attempts to actually to kill as well. So that would add another kind of substantial number to that figure. But when we start to think about broader kind of concerns, we start to fall into what's known as social murder. Now, social murder is not just about deliberate intentions. It's not just about when somebody deliberately decides to wound or to harm an individual with a weapon, or indeed with their own hands. Rather, it comes through social circumstances. So social murder is a concept which was actually introduced by the Chartists back in the 1840s and was popularized by Friedrich Engels. And this was kind of a recognition that without deliberate intention, without the deliberate aim of generating death, in certain scenarios, you can have social conditions where people are likely to die because they cannot sustain life. So that can happen in terms of things like back in the 1840s, it was very much focused on starvation. So the social conditions would lead to famines that nobody would help, and you would have people dying whose lives could have been saved. These are avoidable and premature deaths, and actually people died because of the social conditions that we were living in. This has more recently been used for examples like the Grenfell Tower fire, where people talked about that as being arising through systemic neglect. Where there was a failure to regulate the kind of building of the kind of of kind of high-rise flats, a failure to regulate the kind of modifications undertaken, failure to ensure safety of the residents, and then the complete contempt which the kind of victims then were kind of dealt with by the kind of local authorities in Chelsea and Kensington. And people at that point said, well, these people, nobody deliberately wanted to kill the 72 people who died in Grenfell Tower. But it's not as simple as saying that it was just an accident.
Yeah.
Another example would be the kind of the COVID regulations, where people talk about how the social circumstances of the failure to implement appropriate policies in the early days led to the absolute and total disaster that occurred in social care, in the care homes. So you had kind of lots of people dying prematurely because of a failure in terms of the kind of the government and those in positions of power to act. So what we're seeing here are examples of very serious, deadly harms which are not associated with a given individual and are not associated with the notion of intention, and yet the outcomes are exactly the same. The outcomes are that people are dying too soon. People are dying prematurely, and that these deaths, just like an intentional homicide, are actually avoidable. Now, we could go on and we might well talk about some other historical examples of social murder, because this is a concept which has come into very strong kind of arguments in the last 4 to 5 years in particular about how we conceive responding to the harms. But we could also talk about things like corporate homicide, where the people who die at workplaces, the people who kind of through the failure of health and safety legislation.
Well, are they interlinked, David? Because as you've just mentioned, you know, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've all become very aware of different realities that are going on. And what we perceive as our own individual reality may be it's very different in my own household as how we perceive the realities of what has happened with COVID. So if that's happening just in my household, it's obviously happening around the world about what we perceive as a crime against society and how things are dealt with. Now, it's very hard for us to grasp that people in control may be actually intentionally wanting to harm the people that they are looking after. That's very, very difficult for most people to actually grasp that might be happening. But actually, on a bigger scale, when we see what is happening and the information that we have been given from nature programs, from David Attenborough, about how the world is changing and actually mankind is harming the planet. And then we have COVID and people are dying at ridiculous rates, that if you actually go and look into those figures, that again makes my whole stomach churn about that. And I'm not going to go into all that. That's for people to go and investigate, you know, yourselves. Go and investigate all of that. But what I'm asking David here, because of his background of criminology, is what can we do? What can happen for us to investigate the people who are in the powers that be about this social demise that is happening at the moment?
Okay, I'll answer this on 3 different parts, Rachel, if that's okay. First of all, I'll mention the criminological imagination. Secondly, I'll talk about climate catastrophe, because you've kind of pointed to that a little bit, which again can be associated with social murder. And then thirdly, I'll respond to that very final question, which is how do we actually look to engage with this in terms of various different levels? And that will bring us back to this notion of knowing and not knowing, denial and acknowledgement, ignorance, and so on and so forth. But let me just start with the criminological imagination, because you mentioned how do we make these kind of connections? And I suppose that first point of it's to move away from the intention element, because I don't think that people in positions of power genuinely intend for people when they were making the policies on COVID. I don't think they genuinely intended for there to be all these premature and avoidable deaths in the care homes. I don't think the people who were building and making the renovations of Grenfell Tower had any intention for those people to die. I don't think, if we look at Hillsborough, the kind of neglect that happened with the 97 people that died and the police officers' lives that were associated with it, I don't believe there's any intention there. I don't even believe, when we look at the past, that the ruling elites and the establishment intended for children to die in their thousands of starvation because they would not give them appropriate kind of welfare support. And I don't think, when we look at the kind of cost of living crisis today, that people who are behind that are actually thinking, well, our policies of what we describe as neoliberal capitalism, our kind of policies of kind of promoting profit above human welfare, I don't think they're thinking at the back end of when they're kind of doing all this, that they really think that there's actually that they're deliberately wanting people to die. Unfortunately, those are the outcomes of those kind of policies. When you are neglectful, when you focus on greed, when you focus on kind of maintaining your own interest at the expense of others, then there are harmful outcomes that come from it. And that, as you mentioned at the start of the meeting, that makes me feel nauseous. That makes me feel very upset and both sad and angry at the same time, in terms of that's what criminologists often are kind of looking at, is to try and shine a different light in terms of how we conceive of harm. Now, they do that by deploying what's known as the criminological imagination. And the criminological imagination is inspired by a man called Charles Wright Mills, who was an American academic writing in the 1950s. And criminology has a long history, but it basically evolved as we know it today in the 1970s. And Charles Wright Mills was one of the key inspirational figures behind the kind of criminology that I engage with and behind the criminological imagination. The criminological imagination is kind of very similar to what you had mentioned there about how we deal with things in our own households and how we deal with things with our own kind of family connections. And what Mills said was, it's very important to kind of make a connection between our private troubles and public issues. Because what we often do is we start to kind of bring it down to, it's just about me. It's just about the people around me. It's something that we have to deal with, and it's something which we'll deal with in our small little group. And hence it's a private trouble, and it's something which is kind of, we are finding very difficult to kind of like to engage with. But what we sometimes need to do is recognize that we're not facing it alone. And that actually, if we were to look at other households and other groups and communities and other people, we'd find that they were experiencing very, very similar things. So the key thing then is to transform that into an understanding of this as something which has a wider political and economic and social dimension to it. And all the things that we've been talking about so far have that broader element to them, where there's the kind of, we are individuals, and our biographies are obviously how we live our lives and how we kind of experience the day and our realities around us. But sometimes we need to be a little bit creative in terms of how we're thinking and how we conceive of reality, not just on an individual level, but also on a collective level, and how that what we're experiencing and what we're feeling is not necessarily out of sync with others. But what we often don't do is we don't communicate it and we don't express it, and then we don't push it back up, or we don't actually investigate what the kind of factors are behind it. I often find that people will have anxieties and fears and concerns about all sorts of different things, but they won't necessarily recognize that there are bigger factors sometimes behind those anxieties and fears and worries. So we might worry about unemployment without thinking about the way in which the economy is kind of developing, and that might be generating economic issues, certainly for people in all sorts of different kind of contexts, young and old today. We might kind of be struggling with kind of paying the bills, but not necessarily put this in the context of the wider cost of living crisis. We might well be experiencing other forms of harm, For example, it might be gendered or it might be racialized, and we might be kind of experience something without actually thinking, well, this is because this is how society kind of conceives and responds to people who are black. This is how society responds and perceives to people who are women, or and this is kind of, or men, and these kind of things are about thinking about this in terms of not just our individuals, but also the wider collective. And I suppose I mentioned the second point I would come to is climate catastrophe, because again, you alluded to this in your question about, it's not just about the fears that we have about COVID. It's not just about the kind of economic kind of scenarios that we're facing. We're facing a situation where we're seeing the obliteration of kind of life on the planet. We're seeing a scenario which is referred to as ecocide. Now, ecocide is actually more than climate catastrophe. Climate catastrophe is about the kind of climate heating. And I don't use the kind of terms like climate change, because it's not change. It's actually climate heating, and it's leading us directly towards catastrophe. This is not change for the good. This is kind of leading us towards, in effect, extinction. So we've got an impending catastrophe coming here, and we know that only a small number of corporations are responsible for a massive amount of carbon emissions in the last 50 years. And if I was to kind of cite off companies like Shell and ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP, if I was just to name those as I have just done, I can tell you now that climate catastrophe, in terms of what's happening, is being pushed forward by those different corporations. It's not just about us changing our lifestyles. I'm not saying that we shouldn't get rid of our cars, that we shouldn't stop flying planes, that we shouldn't change our diets, and all the different collective things that we're kind of offering out there as ways moving forward. They're all absolutely correct. But what we do have is to recognize it's people in positions of power with no deliberate intention in the main of actually destroying the planet, who actually are destroying the planet. And that brings me back to that sense of social murder and thinking about our imaginations. Now, the other thing which is interesting in terms of knowledge is that you have, since the 1970s, corporations like ExxonMobil have known without categorical doubt that their policies and their kind of production of fossil fuels was generating climate catastrophe. What did they do in response? Did they look for new forms of kind of carbon capture or kind of zero emissions and so on and so forth? No, they sent out disinformation. They muddied the water on the knowledge and the knowing about climate catastrophe in the first instance. And this has kind of been evidenced by all sorts of different kind of sources about kind of the knowledge that ExxonMobil had, scientific knowledge that it had, which either suppressed or sent out contradictory kind of messages, so that it would kind of cloud the waters for us as a general public, but also for the politicians and those involved in policy decisions. We also know that when we look at the recent kind of policies in terms of protests, because this gets us to our third point, which is what do we do in response? Well, we can do all sorts of different things, but some people think it's important to turn to the streets and to actually go out on various different protests. Now, what we do know is that two of the most recent pieces of legislation have been very much focused on environmental protesters. And we know that one of the kind of piece of legislation which is the Police, Crime, Courts and Sentencing Act from last year. We know that came from a think tank. The ideas behind that piece of legislation to suppress protest came from a think tank that was funded by ExxonMobil. Right, so we know that. We know that the current Public Order Act, which is going through right now, which is very much focused on trying to actually kind of to stop protesters from locking on, which is where they basically physically attach themselves to the ground so they can't be dragged away by the police. We know that's kind of intended. We know that the policies and the kind of the laws that are coming in right now are all about saying to people, look, we're going to stop your protest before it even starts. Now,
so how is this being allowed to happen then? If we know this, How and why is this being allowed to happen?
Well, it's a really, really good question. And partly because we have to think about the kind of collective mindset of those in positions of power. And this is not kind of conspiratorial. I don't believe in conspiracies, but what I do believe is that there's coincidence of interests among various different people. And when groups are perceived as a threat to the established order, and environmental groups are, which is when we have this similar with the spy cops kind of scandal, where kind of basically the police were integrating various different movements and even kind of fathering children and so on and so forth. We know they focused on left-wing groups and socialist groups because they were seen as a bigger threat. They didn't really touch the right wing, because the right-wing solutions to all of our problems are very simple. Right-wing solutions are blame the poor, blame the migrants, and actually let's let's keep the status quo, but let's kind of focus on people without power as being the problems that we face in our society. Whereas socialists and environmentalists such as Extinction Rebellion have actually looked in the other direction, and they've looked up and they've said, actually, the problem isn't the kind of the small powerless groups that are being generated by the kind of issues in society. The problem is to do with the big corporations. The problem is to do with government corruption. The problem is to do with how our kind of democracies actually operate. And that partly kind of answers your question, Rachel, which is, how has this kind of happened? How has this been kind of allowed to happen? Because the mechanisms of government are very much vested in maintaining things as they are. And they're not like kind of radical ideas and radical change. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the environmental scenario is deteriorating at a very, very radical and rapid pace. And if we want to kind of actually prevent that, we have to actually think radically. We can't just kind of go and kind of have some incremental reforms here and there. So we have to kind of be saying we need to change things on quite a large level. And of course, people in positions of power would then see that as a direct threat to their power. And they don't want to lose their power, whether that be social, economic, cultural, and so on and so forth. Particularly from kind of, people on the kind of bottom end of society and who are pushing up. And that's why we see that very strong resistance to groups like Black Lives Matter.
This sort of brings it full circle in a way to how we started this conversation, of how I actually felt about just opening up the energy of what we're talking about and how it makes you feel. Because if we actually take all of that away, the labels that we give everything, and we actually go, how does it make us feel when we are fearful, when we are ashamed, when we are terrified of losing that comfort? And what does that mean? What does that change mean? It brings up all sorts of sensations within us, like flight and freeze, fawn mechanism of survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, we will literally do anything to carry on living and not change if possible, because we enjoy the luxuries that we have, and it's beautiful. But actually, with the work that I'm doing as an energy therapist, and the people that are coming through to me from COVID, from the burnout of what is actually happening, from the financial aspect of the decline of the economy globally right now, of the fear of children who are struggling at school because they see the panic of their parents and what they're going through, is criminal, because there are ways of dealing with this now that are really quite fast. People do not need to suffer. People do not need to starve. But bringing this back on a personal responsibility aspect of what we all need to do is actually, first of all, look at ourselves. I'm a highly sensitive person. Now, if I'm that way, I know I am not the only person on the planet that feels like this. And it's people who are on the spectrum in any way, shape or form feel this. They pick it up immediately, and they are struggling, absolutely struggling with it. But we're also leading the way in change of having that personal responsibility and taking it upon ourselves to acknowledge our emotions. What can we do about it? How do we deal with it? And it changes your life. And as it changes your life, it changes what you offer to your community. And as you change what you offer to your community, it changes what happens into your country. And if you're changing what happens into your country, it changes what happens globally.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back on a few of those points, Rich, because I think it's really, really powerfully put there by yourself. I think that's beautifully kind of said, and I've said. I think that, interestingly enough, there is elements of that which actually become reflected in criminology. So maybe if I just throw in some of those criminological kind of aspects. I mean, what criminologists describe the issue of emotions is they call it effectiveness and of being effective and like the emotional dimensions, and it's become increasingly pertinent in criminology, largely inspired by feminist inspired thinkers over the last few decades, to really bring out this notion of emotions and why emotions are so important and how we kind of feel. And that notion of fear is something which has been very strongly pushed forward in recent years, but it's also something which has a slightly longer history. And indeed, the term moral panics was introduced back in the 1960s by a criminologist called Stan Cohen. And he looked at folk devils and moral panics. It was his PhD thesis, and he was looking at the mods and rockers and the disturbances that happened at Clapton Beaches in the 1960s. And what he kind of identified was that fear was palpable at that time, but people directed their fears not against what was actually going on in society, not against the big kind of issues, because there was a lot of fears about youth subculture. There was a lot of fears about where society was evolving in the 1960s, but they focused them in and they focused their fears on a relatively powerless group of young working class boys. And that was where the moral panics terms come from, where we feel that emotional response, but we're unable to kind of like to connect it to the real sources of what our anxieties and fears are. So I think what you're saying there about trying to really kind of bring out that notion of our sense of emotion and our sense of kind of feelings, that's key. And I want to come back to this on two quick points. The second I'm going to talk about is this notion of kind of love and energy and love, because I think that's really, really, really important. But the first I want to just kind of touch on is the notion of responsibility. And I agree with you in terms of that issue of responsibility, but I might have a slightly different take on it and take it away from kind of personal responsibility and associate with the responsibility of power. Now, many people who'll be listening here today, and kind of many people who kind of who are kind of engaging with these kind of issues, will probably have a certain semblance of power in their own kind of way. You know, whether that's economic power, cultural power, educational power, social power. You know, kind of we have various different forms of capital, whether that be kind of our education or our kind of our networks, or whether it's our jobs and our financial kind and so on and so forth. Or maybe it's because of our kind of identity and kind of within a given set of identity dimensions in a society in which we kind of benefit from the power structures underscoring our identities, or we don't, depending on kind of course, who we are. But there isn't a sense of responsibility where I think there is more responsibility the higher up you go with the echelon of power. And I think the people at the very top have the greatest responsibility. And the power, if we're going to have power, it can only be explored in a great sense of responsibility. And indeed, that notion of us, our responsibility for others, and not our responsibility for ourselves, but also our responsibilities for those on the underside of power. And I've been very heavily influenced by an ethicist called Enrique Dussel, who basically has written a number of different books about people on the underside of power. He's actually an Argentinian philosopher. And he's written about that our greatest responsibilities are for those who have the least power in society, because their voices are the least likely to be heard, because their opinions and their kind of experiences are the least likely to become part of the mainstream. So we have a kind of, and this is one of the reasons why when we're talking about criminology, you know, I haven't just kind of shone a light and mentioned the kind of harms of the power, but the harms that are perpetrated against the powerless. And, you know, when we start talking about women, children, men, boys, whether young or old, who've basically experienced incredible hardship because of social conditions, their voices often are not heard because they are not going to be very easily represented. And that's why people sometimes turn to public protest like Black Lives Matter, because that's the only way they feel that their voices can be heard. But we need to listen, and we have a responsibility, I think, to listen very carefully to the voices of those on the downside of power, the voices of the people who are least likely to be heard,
Yeah.
and also to sometimes even kind of not necessarily be advocates for them, because we should ultimately be trying to provide a platform for those voices. But if those voices can't be heard, if they are what we call subaltern, they're the voices of people who kind of who actually are voiceless. The subaltern cannot speak is a kind of very famous phrase by an Indian kind of a philosopher called Spivak, who basically kind of back in the 1980s kind of was looking at the experience of impoverished women in India, and kind of how they just simply had no voice in terms of how democratic processes or in terms of anything worked in that given society at that time. So we have to recognize that some people will be kind of on the bottom, and our responsibility is to actually try and hear those voices, and not to kind of to be condescending, but to try and understand them, to actually to try and learn from them. And it's that sense of perpetual learning from the experiences of other people, which is kind of absolutely key, I think, to the kind of criminology that I certainly advocate and I've been kind of involved in kind of working towards, and developing new knowledges. Because it's not just about knowledge itself, it's about the kind of knowledge that it is. It's the kind of questions that it's been kind of asking. It's the kind of knowledge that's being generated, and in whose interest that knowledge serves. And I've mentioned the example of ExxonMobil a little bit earlier about generating knowledge which was kind of about muddying the waters and mystifying. And that might still be the same as knowledge. It might still be seen as knowing, but it's not the kind of knowing which is kind of ethically appropriate. And it certainly isn't responsible knowing, because it isn't engaging with those people whose voices are not otherwise heard. So I think that responsibility is for all of us to try and be kind of listen to those people who often aren't heard, and to kind of to remember to push that responsibility back onto those who have the greatest power, because they're the ones who ultimately can change. But just one final.
This is music to my ears, David. It really is. But it's conversations like this now which are becoming even more important, because I know I can speak for those women, for those people who have no voice, because literally those are the people that I work with in therapy, where they can't, and I've been there for myself, where they cannot vocalize actually the pain and the suffering that's actually happened to them in their life. They don't even know that they have an option of what to say, because they don't have the words for it. It's so closed off in their life that can be enabled for them. They are so powerless that as I'm working with these people to enable that voice to open up, that permission to give themselves to actually stand in their own power, and what that means is enabling now group work to come together. This is intentional work that is working in a very, very different way than the mainstream that we have known throughout our history. And this information that is out there is changing. It is changing at a vibrational level that we are tapping more and more into.
Well, I think that's a brilliant way of just put that, Rich. I think that's so important. I just want to pick up on two themes there, and just trying to reiterate your point about voice and how pain destroys voice and suffering destroys voice. And I suppose the kind of classic example that was given of this, because it wasn't really acknowledged for a long time, but when people on the battlefield of the Somme, when they were lying wounded, they were lying on the ground dying, there was no words coming out. They were in so much suffering they couldn't speak. All they could do was moan.
Yeah.
And because we know this is what trauma does, we know this is what pain and suffering does. It isn't the kind of people don't want to talk about because it's too painful to talk about it, or they simply don't have the words to talk about it, or they just simply just don't want to go back and face and articulate what's actually kind of happened. Of course, therapy is kind of a way which evolved to try and kind of to try and address that. Instead of burying it and going into denial, people try and kind of confront it and move forward and go post the kind of trauma. But that's the kind of example which I think is just illustrates that the more suffering we're in, the less likely we are to speak. And that's again another indication of why we have to try and bend over backwards and sometimes read the silences. It's not just about hearing what people say, it's also trying to work out what they're not saying, because sometimes they just simply don't have the ability to kind of have the ability to speak. So I think that's really, really kind of fundamental in terms of that notion of a voice, is that voice actually can be neutralized and denied, and therefore there's no knowledge coming from that because the person is unable to generate the knowledge in the first instance. And then the second thing, and it goes back to a point I was going to come to in the previous kind of response, which is about love.
Mm.
And I think that recognizing the importance of love as a source of energy, and recognizing our source of love, not for ourselves, obviously, but love for others.
Yeah.
And what is sometimes referred to as love as a living humanity. And this is kind of can take us forward and draw upon that kind of energy, to draw upon that kind of sense of, I suppose, it's almost kind of spiritual kind of side to this, not necessarily in a kind of a formal religious kind of sense, but in a sense of us being able to connect with others, to get that sense of being, to have that sense of knowing where the kind of energies lie and how that can energize us as well as how we can energize others. And I think that one of the key elements is love.
Yeah.
And if we have a love for others, we have a love, not just kind of a sense of romantic love, but it's a sense that we love other human beings, and that we love, and we may well love other species. And as
Mm.
you mentioned there, kind of the healing that can go into kind of those that we species and those people that we kind of care about. And I think if we want to kind of move forward in terms of healing this world, we need to recognize the kind of a species approach, which can care for those voiceless animals, care for those, because we talk about people who don't have a voice, or kind of living entities that don't have a voice. Then of course that involves most of the planet. There's a kind of wonderful statement about, can trees speak? And can trees have human rights? And can we recognize these different things? And I think that's one of the things that our love for this planet, our love for Earth, our love for others, our love for simply where we're at right now, and to appreciate this amazing, beautiful world. And we live in a wonderful part of the world, Rachel, and we've been on many walks with our dogs and walked around the wonderful rivers, River Irwell, and the woods, and all around the lines where we've been walking. And you know what? I think it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And it's under threat. It doesn't feel like it's under threat, but we know that the species in this country have been decimated since 1970. We know we've got less birds, we've got less wildlife. Just in the UK, who speaks for those? And they don't deliberately and intentionally do what they do to actually destroy the planet, but they do have their shareholders' profits to meet. They do have various different ways, and unfortunately, it's systemic.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's rooted within the kind of way that the corporations actually kind of operate, that we are heading towards this terrible, terrible, avoidable tragedy. And it's not that things can't change, because if things change very, very slowly, everyone and all the species have time to adapt, but they're changing so fast that nothing can stand in the way to meet that survival. But you've mentioned it a couple of times, that joy of survival, that joy of living, that love of living, that love of other humanity, that love of our planet. And that's where the energy is. And if we can express that, but do so in a way which is not only through connecting with others, because we get our strength collectivity, we get our strength in those ways of sharing with others.
And I
Let
think
us
that's going
kind
to
of
be
make the
very
change.
interesting to see what is going to be happening over the next few years, about how things are going to change really drastically. And the beautiful thing is that the Nobel Prize this year has gone to 3 physicists, quantum physicists, who have made real progress in proving that one proton, whether that's just across a river, has exactly the same effect on another proton. So there's this entanglement between them. But they've also discovered that it doesn't matter whether that is a billion light years away. They've actually done this with, you'll have to look this up, I'll put the link in another universe. They've actually managed to identify that these protons still have a same effect, even no matter how far away that they are entangled. Now, if they are entangled in our universe, we are certainly entangled together on this planet. We can't avoid the process. So if we can resonate on that wavelength, on those protons of love, what can we create?
Well, we can start to move towards a form of justice. And because that's the kind of other thing which I'm very interested in, is the notion of liberative justice. And there's various different ways of conceiving justice, but for me, justice is about emancipation. Justice is about, it's always going to be aspirational. We're never going to be able to fine tune it down to one thing. But I find that the talk of a criminal justice system very, very profoundly problematic, because I can't see how the criminal justice system actually delivers any form of justice for anybody, whether that be the people who've been harmed or the people who've done wrong. It's actually, it fails everybody, and it always has done, unfortunately. We've got very small numbers and glimmers of light here and there. But if we can work together and we can be together, and we can recognize, as you just mentioned ever so eloquently there, Rachel, this kind of connectedness between all of us. And we have this kind of sense sometimes of bringing things down to the individual and bringing it down to a small group of people around us. And we think that's where our kind of moral concerns arise. But if we look at it on a bigger scale and we start to take responsibility for the planetary kind of health, and it's obviously a very, very big task. And in fact, this is when we start talking about knowing and not knowing. It's very difficult to know. We should be trying to kind of reach out and do all these kind of amazing things, because there's people who are dying of starvation all around the world. There's all sorts of problems happening in China with the Uyghurs. We've got the situation in Ukraine. We've got the situation in Afghanistan, where the Americans have stolen all the money. We've got famine across a number of different countries in Africa. We've got political issues happening in South America. We've had just this recently called the climate issues that happen in Australia, the fires in North America. We know that we all are part of one. We know that, and these are all interconnected. What's happening on one part of the globe is because of things happening elsewhere. So we need to look at it in terms of a global justice and a liberative justice. We need to look at this in terms of, finding emancipation and finding a way of freedom for all people, and finding a way of actually recognizing our stewardship of the planet. The species of this planet are not there to be exploited. We almost lost the bees. And we know that almost like if we lose the bees, the whole planetary system is going to collapse. If we lose so much of this planet, the planet cannot continue, because it's incredibly intricate. And we have to recognize our responsibility on that kind of global and planetary level. Incredibly hard to keep that focused in our heads. And that's why we need to focus on the responsibilities of the powerful, because the powerful are not starving.
So much abundance in the world.
There is, and so it's the people who have the most who have to show the greatest leadership and responsibility, but they're failing to do that, because that's obviously the thing, is power in itself is corruptible.
Oh, surely, David, now is a time for us to completely turn upside down at the approach that has been going on for years of oppression and the fear, and to literally turn it on its head and try love. Because when we resonate at love in small groups and then in our wider community, 10 minutes at a time, but within a group of doing this, the power behind that is palpable. You feel it. I mean, it's having literal effects with people's emotional, physical health. But to be able to do this, to actually transform a whole community and country, if we start to do this together more and more, and we're resonating at the frequency of love, means embodying it. It's not just thinking about it. It's not just thinking, oh yeah, I love that. I love that tree out there. It's a really nice tree, and I love it when it blossoms and it flowers. It's not just about acknowledging that you might love it because it looks pretty. It's actually feeling the essence of what that tree brings and connecting with it and doing that as a group. And actually, when we set our intentions so precisely to shift from fear and regenerate it through our bodies into love, you feel that chemical reaction. You feel that transition. And then when we're able to expand that out through us, out into the planet, and there are ways of actually doing that, and it's really simple. It's really, really simple. And everybody can do it, and we can all learn to do it. But if we do that together, it opens up creativity inside of us that opens up new, different pathways of, oh, we've suddenly got this way of doing something that I didn't think of before. This is how scientists like Newton and Einstein got their theories in the first place. Well, they had these magical, mystical moments of enlightenment.
That's kind of what you said is absolutely key, because we're currently shaped by hate. And one of the ways the criminal process works, and one of the ways the kind of notions of crime operates in our society on an ideological level, is to make us fearful and to make us hate. And, I always think about kind of Orwell's 1984, and, when which obviously people are completely suppressed, but they have that wall of hate, don't they? And the kind of wailing where everybody expresses for a certain number of minutes every day how much they hate. And it's a way that, again, it's an emotional reaction, but it's the wrong emotional reaction. And what we need to do is to kind of to recognise in our society that the most harmful groups and harmful people in our society are those at the top end of society. And that's not to say that people at the bottom end don't do harmful things. We mentioned intentional homicide earlier. Nobody's kind of trying to take away any of the kind of the harm and the hurt and the suffering that's generated in these street level crimes or interpersonal violence. And, we don't take issues like rape and sexual violence seriously enough. And I mean, just look at the attrition rate. We have to look at that very, very carefully because it's appalling. It's collapsed. Number of people.
It comes back to power, doesn't it? It comes back to somebody needing power over somebody else.
It does. I mean, the biggest issue of crime is power.
Yeah.
It's not power. Crime is not linked with poverty. There are certain kinds of harm that's linked with poverty, but the biggest forms of harm are those who exercise and brutalize power. So if you want to address crime and you want to find a way that's going to ethically respond to it, you need to look at power and you need to be focused on power, because it's governments who are most likely to kill people, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. And we could look at the kind of number of people who were killed by the states in the 20th century. And the states are the biggest serial killers that we have. Corporations are the biggest serial killers and potentially planet killers. So we need to kind of recognize that power issue is going to be absolutely fundamental. And yet we're constantly told about kind of certain harms done by certain groups of people. We're getting a little bit more conscious of it now because we're starting to hear about people like Wayne Couzens in the Sarah Everard case. We're starting to hear about kind of other kind of situations where police officers, the people who are there to protect us, are actually perpetrating sexual violence, or indeed, in Tyre Mitchell, in kind of the case of George Floyd in America. And we can go through a myriad of different kind of deaths in custody, and particularly black deaths in custody by the police in this country. And we see that the police are actually kind of using excessive violence. And we don't kind of include those forms of violence that are perpetrated by agents of the state within our kind of sense of notions of intentional homicide and murder. We don't think about those policies, such as austerity, which can kind of lead to all sorts, hundreds of thousands of people dying prematurely. We don't look historically back at kind of forms of state massacres and state violence. We kind of get them hidden. We don't look at kind of the starvation that occurred across the British Empire, where kind of whole nations sometimes were kind of had the food taken from their mouths, literally, so they could feed armies. And we don't look at the kind of situations in, like, even us here in East Lancashire, where we had kind of mass child deaths back in the 1820s, 1830s, where literally these things become hidden. The knowledge of them becomes lost. So we need to kind of grasp that knowledge, and we need to acknowledge that knowledge, and we need to respond to it with love, and we need to respond to it with compassion and an awareness of power and power dynamics and responsibility of the powerful. And how we respond is exactly as you've been saying. We need to have that energy. We need to look after ourselves. We need that wellness. So it's not just a battle of truth. It's not just a battle of knowledge. It's about the right truth. It's about using our love and our compassion and our understanding of how society works, using our criminological imaginations to refocus, as you said, Rachel, to rethink, to redefine what's actually going on, and to start to engage some profoundly radical solutions. Now, many people will close their minds to that, and they'll go back to the hate, and they'll go back to the fear, and they'll say, well, this isn't going to work. Well, the tragedy is that as a society, we profoundly fail to deal with the sex offenders. We've absolutely failed. And when it comes to murderers, we profoundly fail to deal with those who perpetrate social murder. The people who do the greatest harms to us in society are not the people who are actually being held responsible by this society in terms of the criminal process. What we should be doing is listening to those who've been harmed and finding out what we can do to heal and to respond and to repair, to provide reparations and so on and so forth. But to recognize that those in power are actually with impunity and immunity perpetrating some of the most dreadful harms that exist in our society, and yet we do not talk about them when it comes to discussions about crime and punishment. That's the knowledge that's missing, I think, as a critical criminologist and abolitionist, is to ultimately to shine a light on those harms and to make sure that they are part of the discussion, and that when we come to an objective account of the harms that exist in our society, we recognize just exactly how well we respond to those social harms.
Oh, David, I can't tell you how this conversation has turned around from me from the very beginning of feeling nauseous to now feeling really quite elated that you're on here. It's absolutely wonderful. And everything that you've just said there, oh, I'm feeling it as a truth, absolutely deep within my soul. And I think that's where our truth actually comes from. We've got to be able to feel it and resonate so that we can stand firm in our own belonging of knowing that actually, no matter what you throw at me, no matter what you're going to say as your truth, that isn't mine. My truth is because I have literally gone back through my own timelines of my own family, down my mother's line. I've gone down my father's line to clear any of those emotional blockages and issues that have held me back from moving forward. And I've taken people down, many people down this route as well. So most people who have long-term COVID and burnout, literally, it is either from childhood or beyond. And it's not all their stuff. It's not all their fear. It's not just your fear that you are hanging on to. It's your mother's, because your mother has felt fear. Your grandmother has felt fear. Her mother has felt fear. And if that line has constantly been in shame or guilt about the fear and not being able to have their own power and not even know how to get their own power and what to do with it, it comes back through to you, through your DNA, through that entanglement of those protons just keep coming back through to you. And we are here, I believe, in this lifetime to actually start dealing with that and going back into our own personal history, like you've been delving in to find out all the historical information. But then if we take that personally and we do that journey ourselves, which doesn't take a great deal of time, and it's actually extremely cathartic, because when you actually experience it, and it is an experience, you've only got to look at the programs such as the ancestral programs where somebody has adopted and they need to find their background, they need to find their parents, and then Davina McCall might take them on the journey to actually find what's happened in that background, and they feel the emotion. They are emotionally attached to that piece of paper or that place where they know that their grandparents have been. They feel it. It's an experience. And that's the experience that we take people on to actually overcome and heal their past. And if we can start to heal our past with all of the trauma that you've been talking about, then we automatically want to generate a new future for ourselves, because we don't and won't continue living the way that we have been. It automatically puts us on this new path of change, which we stand firm in. And it gives us power, and it is like being plugged into the mains of having this personal power that literally makes your spine straighten. You stand up, your eyes sparkle, you've got a creativity in actually moving forward and creating something new. Hence, that's why the Weird World of Knowing podcast is here, to bring people like you out to talk to people like me, where we're totally poles apart from the world that you live in. But for me to be able to come here with you and for us to dissect it into a language that hopefully other people will understand, we're regenerating it. We're regenerating the mythology of what criminology meant to me.
Yeah, and I think kind of you've very eloquently detailed the philosophical basis, which I think I share entirely. I would agree, and again, I agree we come from very different backgrounds, but I kind of agree with every single word that you just said, because I thought, yes, that's exactly it. If we can recognize that past, we can then start to rethink it, reimagine it, and then we can move forward with a different kind of future. And that's exactly what kind of my work tries to do in terms of thinking about crime and punishment, to rethink it, to look back at it historically and in the present, and to imagine a different world where we can actually have much less harm, we can have much less avoidable deaths, we can have a much greater appreciation and aspiration towards a kind of justice which actually does do justice for all.
Oh, David, I have absolutely adored this conversation. I know that we could literally talk all day, but I am going to have to bring this to a halt now. But people, I'm going to put David's information in so that you can have a look through the many books and details that he's got for you to trail through. And you can contact him. Where are you, David? Open University. The Open University. I've got so much going through my mind now of everything that we have talked about. And I'm just buzzing. So I can't thank you enough, from literally that feeling of nausea when we first started about criminology, to now know that there are people like you making changes, and really beautiful changes, about how this is all looked at. Makes my heart sing.
That's
And
very kind of you,
our
thank you.
conversation today, we're creating something new. We're regenerating as we speak, and that to me is the way forward. So David,
Brilliant.
thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful kind of conversation.